Our apartment building wasn't anything special. The walls were thin, the elevators creaked, and the hallway lights flickered on their own schedule. But it was home. Daniel, my husband, and I had lived there for nearly 5 years, content in our little corner of the city. That was until Mark moved in. He was our new neighbor, a man with an easy smile and an energy that seemed to light up the dim hallways of our building. We ran into him for the first time when he was balancing a box awkwardly on one knee while trying to unlock his door. "Need a hand?" I asked, stepping out of our apartment. "Wouldn't say no," he replied with a grin. I helped him with the box, and from that moment, Mark became a fixture in our lives. He was charming, friendly, and always seemed to know just the right thing to say. At first, our interactions were innocent. Mark would knock on our door to borrow a cup of sugar or ask for recommendations about the neighborhood. Sometimes he'd join Daniel and me for a drink in the evening, his laughter filling the room as he shared stories about his travels and his work as a freelance graphic designer. But as weeks turned into months, something shifted. Mark started texting me, little things at first, like asking for advice about a recipe or sharing a funny meme. I told myself it was harmless, but deep down, I knew I was crossing a line. One evening, Daniel was working late, and Mark texted to say he'd made too much lasagna and wondered if I wanted to share it. I hesitated, then replied, "Sure, why not?" When I knocked on his door, the smell of garlic and baked cheese filled the air. Mark greeted me with his signature grin, and for the next few hours, we ate, drank wine, and talked about everything from movies to our shared love of travel. It was easy, too easy. And when I got up to leave, Mark stopped me, his hand brushing mine. "You're incredible, you know that," he said, his voice soft. I laughed awkwardly, stepping back. "I should go," I said quickly, my heart racing. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me as I walked out the door. The next time Daniel worked late, Mark invited me over again. This time, I knew better, but I went anyway. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As I walked back to my apartment that night, guilt consumed me. I loved Daniel, I knew that with every fiber of my being. But something about Mark had filled a void I didn't even realize was there. Over the next few weeks, I tried to pretend nothing had happened. I avoided Mark, ignored his texts, and threw myself into my relationship with Daniel. But Mark wasn't so easily dismissed. He started showing up unexpectedly, at my door, in the parking lot, even at the coffee shop where I worked. His once charming demeanor turned into something clingy, almost desperate. "We need to talk," he said one evening when I ran into him in the hallway. "There's nothing to talk about," I said firmly. "You can't just pretend this didn't happen," he replied, his voice low. "I can, and I will," I shot back, my heart pounding. But even as I walked away, I knew it wasn't over. Daniel wasn't oblivious. He started asking questions, why I seemed distracted, why I flinched every time my phone buzzed, why I'd suddenly stopped mentioning Mark. "Is everything okay?" he asked one night as we sat on the couch. "Yeah, of course," I said quickly, forcing a smile. But I could tell he didn't believe me. One afternoon, as I walked to my car, Mark appeared seemingly out of nowhere. "This isn't fair," he said, blocking my path. "What isn't fair?" I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "You can't just cut me off like this," he said. "We had something." "No, we didn't," I said firmly. "And I need you to leave me alone." But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't going to let go so easily. It all came to a head one evening when Daniel came home early and found me arguing with Mark in the hallway. "What's going on here?" Daniel asked, his eyes narrowing. "Nothing," I said quickly, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Mark smirked, as if daring me to come clean. "Caroline and I were just having a conversation," he said, his tone laced with implication. Daniel's jaw tightened, and he looked at me. "Caroline, is there something you need to tell me?" The truth was on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Instead, I turned and walked back into our apartment, leaving Daniel and Mark standing in the hallway. When the door closed behind me, I pressed my back against it and slid to the floor, my heart pounding. The confrontation in the hallway felt like a bomb detonating, leaving shockwaves that would reverberate through my life. Moments later, Daniel walked in, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at me as if trying to piece together a puzzle he hadn't realized was broken. "Caroline," he said finally, his voice trembling. "What's going on?" I couldn't keep the truth from him any longer. The weight of it was suffocating, and I knew I owed him honesty, no matter how much it hurt. "I made a mistake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "With Mark." Daniel's face fell, the shock and betrayal washing over him like a tidal wave. "What kind of mistake?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The worst kind," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving me alone with the silence and the crushing weight of my choices. The days that followed were excruciating. Daniel stayed at a friend's place, and the apartment felt emptier than it ever had. I wanted to call him, to beg for his forgiveness, but I didn't know where to start. Mark, on the other hand, was relentless. He texted, knocked on my door, and even left notes under the welcome mat. "We can figure this out," one note read. "Don't shut me out." But the sight of his handwriting made my stomach churn. Desperate to end his interference, I agreed to meet Mark in a neutral location, a coffee shop far enough away that no one we knew would see us. When I arrived, he was already there, a hopeful expression on his face. "Caroline," he said, standing to greet me. "Don't," I said sharply, sitting down across from him. "This needs to stop." "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone incredulous. "We had something real." "No, we didn't," I said firmly. "It was a mistake. And I need you to leave me alone." His expression darkened. "You can't just walk away from this," he said, his voice low. "I already have," I replied, standing and walking out before he could say another word. That evening, I finally worked up the courage to call Daniel. The phone rang several times before he answered, his voice cold and distant. "What do you want, Caroline?" he asked. "I want to talk," I said, my voice trembling. "I want to explain." "There's nothing to explain," he said. "You cheated. You lied. What else is there to say?" "I made a terrible mistake," I said, tears welling up. "But I love you, Daniel. And I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." For a moment, there was silence. Then he sighed heavily. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "But I'm not promising anything." When Daniel arrived the next day, the air between us was thick with tension. He sat on the couch, arms crossed, while I sat across from him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "I'm sorry," I said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I need you to know how much I regret what I did." Daniel's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, his anger softened. "Why, Caroline?" he asked. "Why him? Why now?" "I don't know," I admitted. I felt lost, invisible. And Mark, he made me feel seen. But it wasn't real, Daniel. It was a distraction, and it cost me the most important thing in my life, you. He shook his head, his expression a mix of hurt and disbelief. "I don't know if I can get past this," he said. "I'll wait," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. "As long as it takes. I'll do whatever it takes." After Daniel left, I began to take steps to rebuild my life and prove my commitment to change. I blocked Mark's number, avoided any places I might run into him, and started seeing a therapist to understand the reasons behind my actions. In therapy, I began to unpack the feelings of insecurity and dissatisfaction that had led me down this path. You can't change the past, my therapist said. But you can learn from it. And you can choose to do better moving forward. Over time, Daniel and I began to talk more, brief, cautious conversations that felt like tiny steps toward reconciliation. One evening, he came over for dinner, and for the first time in weeks, we laughed together over an old inside joke. It's been a long time since we did this, he said, his expression wistful. It has, I agreed, feeling a glimmer of hope. The path to rebuilding our relationship was far from clear, but for the first time, I felt like there was a chance. It would take time, patience, and a lot of work, but I was willing to do whatever it took. As I lay awake that night, I whispered into the darkness, I'll fight for us, Daniel. No matter what. Rebuilding a relationship after betrayal isn't something you can rush. I learned that the hard way. Every moment of progress felt like a victory, but it was fragile, as if one wrong move could send us back to square one. Daniel wasn't quick to forgive, and I didn't expect him to be. The wounds I'd caused were still raw, and even though he had agreed to talk more, there was an unspoken tension that hung over us during every interaction. Our first few attempts at reconnecting were cautious. We started with brief conversations over coffee, then moved to shared dinners at home. Each interaction felt like walking a tightrope, every word, every gesture weighed against the enormity of what had happened. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, Daniel broke the silence. Do you think you would have told me, if I hadn't found you with him in the hallway? His question caught me off guard, but I forced myself to answer honestly. I don't know, I admitted. But I like to think I would have. Carrying that secret was unbearable. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. I need to know this won't happen again, he said quietly. It won't, I said firmly. I promise. At the recommendation of my therapist, I suggested that Daniel and I attend couples counseling together. He was hesitant at first, but eventually, he agreed. Our counselor, Dr. Mason, was patient but direct. Rebuilding trust takes time, she said during our first session. It also takes vulnerability from both of you. For Daniel, vulnerability meant admitting how deeply I'd hurt him. I feel like I don't know who you are anymore, he said one session, his voice trembling. For me, it meant acknowledging the reasons behind my actions. I felt invisible in our relationship, I said. But that's not an excuse for what I did. I should have talked to you instead of turning to someone else. Dr. Mason helped us navigate these painful conversations, encouraging us to focus on honest communication and small steps toward rebuilding our connection. Over time, there were glimmers of hope, moments where the distance between us felt a little smaller. One weekend, we decided to tackle a long-overdue project, reorganizing the storage closet. As we sorted through old boxes, we found a stack of photos from our early years together. Look at this one, Daniel said, holding up a picture of us at a beach, our faces sunburned but happy. I remember that trip, I said, smiling. We got lost trying to find the hotel, and you refused to ask for directions. He laughed, the sound warm and familiar. For a moment, it felt like the old days, before the mistakes, before the distance. Despite these moments, there were still times when doubt crept in. Daniel would grow quiet, and I'd wonder if he was replaying what had happened. Other times, I'd catch myself worrying that he'd never be able to trust me again. One evening, I finally asked him, "Do you think we'll ever get past this?" He was silent for a long moment before answering. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I want to try." That simple statement gave me more hope than anything else had. Just as it felt like Daniel and I were finding our footing, Mark made an unwelcome reappearance. It started with a text, "Can we talk?" From a number I didn't recognize but immediately knew was his. I deleted the message without responding, but my unease lingered. What if he showed up at the building again? What if Daniel found out? A week later, I spotted Mark in the parking lot as I returned from work. He didn't approach me, but his presence was enough to send my anxiety spiraling. That evening, I told Daniel about the encounter. "I don't want to keep secrets anymore," I said. His expression was serious but calm. "Do you think he's going to be a problem?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he's not." Daniel nodded, and for the first time, I felt like we were truly a team. With Daniel's support, I filed a report with the building management, requesting that Mark be warned about his behavior. I also made it clear to Mark, via a final text, that any further contact would result in a police report. He didn't respond, and for the next few weeks, there was no sign of him. Slowly, my anxiety began to ease. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Daniel reached for my hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. "I think we're going to be okay," he said quietly. I turned to him, tears welling up in my eyes. "I hope so," I said. "I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm worth it." "You don't have to prove anything," he said. "You just have to keep being honest." Rebuilding trust wasn't a straight path. There were setbacks, difficult conversations, and moments of doubt. But there were also moments of connection, forgiveness, and love. As we moved forward, I felt a renewed sense of hope, not just for our relationship, but for the life we were creating together. The days began to feel lighter. Not in a sudden, transformative way, but like the slow lifting of a fog. Daniel and I were finding our way back to each other, one step at a time. The pain wasn't gone, but it was no longer the only thing between us. Our life together became a delicate balance of rebuilding trust, sharing laughter, and confronting the realities of what had happened. One of the hardest parts of our journey was relearning how to be vulnerable with each other. Before the affair, we'd taken our connection for granted, assuming we understood each other without always putting in the effort to communicate. Now, we were starting fresh. One evening, as we sat on the couch, Daniel asked, "What's something you've always wanted to do but never told me?" The question caught me off guard, but I appreciated his effort to connect. "I've always wanted to take a painting class," I admitted. He smiled. "Then you should. Maybe I'll even join you." The idea of sharing a new experience together felt like a step towards something better. Dr. Mason had encouraged us to find ways to create new traditions as a couple, something that was uniquely ours and marked this new chapter in our relationship. We decided to start a monthly bucket list night. Each month, we'd take turns picking an activity, something we'd never done before. The first night, Daniel chose a local cooking class. We laughed through the entire evening, fumbling our way through making sushi rolls and competing over who could plate theirs more beautifully. "It's a tie," Daniel declared, holding up his slightly lopsided roll. "It's definitely not," I teased, showing off mine. Moments like these reminded us that rebuilding wasn't just about hard conversations, it was also about rediscovering joy. Despite our progress, there were still moments when the past resurfaced, forcing us to confront the lingering pain. One night, as we sat in therapy, Daniel brought up something that had been bothering him. "I still don't understand why," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "What did Mark give you that I didn't?" The question was like a punch to the gut, but I knew he deserved an answer. "It wasn't about him," I said carefully. "It was about me. I felt invisible, like I'd lost who I was. And instead of talking to you about it, I looked for a quick fix. But it was a mistake, a terrible mistake, and it had nothing to do with what you did or didn't do." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I wish you'd come to me," he said quietly. "I do too," I said, tears streaming down my face. "And I promise, from now on, I will." Forgiveness wasn't a single moment, it was a series of choices, made over time. One afternoon, as we walked through the park, Daniel said, "I think I'm starting to forgive you." His words stopped me in my tracks. "You are." I asked, my voice trembling. He nodded. It doesn't mean I've forgotten, or that it doesn't hurt sometimes. But I'm realizing that holding on to the anger isn't helping either of us. His honesty brought a sense of relief and hope that I hadn't dared to feel before. As we continued to heal, we began to talk more about the future. The idea of starting a family came up again, though this time it felt less like a far-off dream and more like something tangible. Do you think we're ready for that? Daniel asked one evening as we cooked dinner together. I think we're getting there, I said. But I also think we should take it one step at a time. The fact that we could even have that conversation felt like a victory, a sign of how far we'd come. Life, of course, wasn't without its challenges. Work stress, family obligations, and the occasional argument tested our patience and our commitment. One evening, after a particularly tense day, Daniel and I found ourselves arguing over something trivial. This feels like old times, he said sarcastically, throwing his hands in the air. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. We're going to have bad days, I said. But that doesn't mean we're back to square one. He sighed, his expression softening. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. I am too, I said, reaching for his hand. Moments like these reminded us that progress wasn't linear, but it was still progress. On the anniversary of my confession, Daniel surprised me with a small celebration. He'd planned a picnic in the park, complete with a basket of our favorite foods and a handwritten note. In the note, he wrote, Caroline, this year hasn't been easy, but I'm proud of how far we've come. Thank you for your honesty, your effort, and your commitment to us. I'm not saying we're perfect, but I'm saying we're stronger. And I'm grateful for that. His words brought tears to my eyes, and I realized how much we'd accomplished, not just in rebuilding our relationship, but in rediscovering the love that had always been there. As we sat together, watching the sunset, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Our journey wasn't over, but it felt like we were finally on solid ground. We've come a long way, Daniel said, his arm around my shoulders. We have, I agreed, smiling. And I can't wait to see where we go next. By the time we reached the second year of rebuilding, our life felt different. Not perfect, but hopeful. The ache of the past had softened, replaced by a shared commitment to the life we were creating. Daniel and I had begun to dream again, not just about the day-to-day, but about the bigger picture, what we wanted for ourselves, for each other, and for the future we were building together. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a travel show, Daniel turned to me and said, What do you think about finally starting a family? The question wasn't entirely unexpected, but hearing it aloud still made my heart race. I think I'm ready, I said after a moment. Daniel's face broke into a smile. Me too. The conversation that followed was full of excitement and nervousness. We talked about everything from baby names to how we'd handle sleepless nights. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were planning for something together, a shared goal that symbolized how far we'd come. Of course, life had other plans. Months went by without any news, and the anticipation turned into quiet frustration. One afternoon, after yet another doctor's appointment, I came home feeling defeated. What if this doesn't happen for us? I asked Daniel, tears brimming in my eyes. He pulled me into a hug. Then we'll figure something else out, he said. Adoption, fostering, we have options. What matters is that we're in this together. His reassurance gave me the strength to keep going, even as the road ahead felt uncertain. While we navigated the challenges of starting a family, Daniel and I made a conscious effort to focus on the present. We filled our days with small joys, cooking dinner together, taking walks in the park, and planning spontaneous weekend getaways. One weekend, we decided to visit a nearby vineyard. As we wandered through rows of grapevines, sipping wine and laughing about our complete lack of wine knowledge, I felt a sense of lightness I hadn't experienced in years. This is nice, Daniel said, his hand brushing against mine. It is, I agreed, smiling. Around this time, Daniel was offered a promotion at work, a role that would require more travel but also offered the chance to advance his career. "I don't want to take it if it's going to make things harder for us," he said one evening as we discussed the opportunity. "I think you should go for it," I said. "We'll figure it out. Besides, I think we're in a good enough place now to handle the distance." His smile was one of both relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for believing in me." Just as we were settling into this new phase of life, I started feeling off, tired, nauseous, and unusually emotional. At first, I chalked it up to stress, but something in the back of my mind urged me to take a pregnancy test. When the second line appeared, I stared at it in disbelief. "Daniel!" I called, my voice trembling. He came rushing into the room, concern etched on his face. "What's wrong?" I held up the test, unable to speak. His expression shifted from confusion to pure joy. "Are you serious?" he asked. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "We're going to be parents," I said. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and excitement. We turned the spare room into a nursery, attended prenatal classes, and found ourselves daydreaming about what our child might be like. One evening, as we painted the nursery walls a soft shade of yellow, Daniel said, "Do you think we'll be good parents?" "I think we'll figure it out," I replied, smiling. "Just like we've figured everything else out." The day our baby was born was the most emotional experience of my life. Holding that tiny, perfect being in my arms, I felt a love so overwhelming it brought me to tears. Daniel sat beside me, cradling our baby with the same awe I felt. "We did this," he said softly. "We did," I agreed, my heart full. Life as new parents was chaotic and exhausting, but it was also beautiful. Late-night feedings turned into quiet moments of connection, and every milestone, first smiles, first words, first steps, felt like a victory. Through it all, Daniel and I leaned on each other, finding strength in our partnership. "We're a good team," he said one evening as we rocked our baby to sleep. "The best," I replied, smiling. As our child grew, so did our dreams. Daniel's career was thriving, and I'd begun exploring my own passions, taking painting classes and even showcasing some of my work at a local gallery. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel said, "Do you think we'll look back on this time and realize it was the happiest of our lives?" "I think it's just the beginning," I said, leaning against him. His arm tightened around me. "I like the sound of that," he said. Looking back, it was clear how far we'd come, not just from the pain of the past, but from the complacency that had once defined our relationship. We weren't perfect, but we were strong. And together, we were building a life that was full of love, purpose, and hope for the future. Parenthood changed everything. It reshaped our days, stretched our patience, and filled our lives with a kind of love we hadn't known before. But it also brought new challenges, moments of exhaustion, misunderstandings, and the pressure to balance who we were as individuals with who we were as parents. Through it all, Daniel and I found ways to stay connected. The lessons we'd learned about communication, vulnerability, and forgiveness became our guideposts, helping us navigate this new phase of life. In those early months, life revolved around our baby. Sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and constant feedings left us both exhausted, but somehow, we found joy in the chaos. One evening, as I rocked our baby to sleep, Daniel came into the nursery and leaned against the doorframe, watching us with a soft smile. "You're amazing, you know that," he said quietly. I laughed, tired but grateful. "We're a team," I said. "And I wouldn't want anyone else on my team," he replied. As much as we loved our new roles as parents, finding balance was a struggle. Between Daniel's demanding job and my efforts to carve out time for myself, there were days when it felt like we were running on autopilot. One night, after an especially hectic day, we sat on the couch in silence, both too tired to speak. "I miss us," Daniel said finally, breaking the quiet. Me too, I admitted. We decided to make a change. Every week, we'd set aside one evening for just the two of us, no phones, no distractions, just time to reconnect. Our first date night was simple, takeout and a board game at home. But as we laughed and reminisced, it felt like a step toward reclaiming the connection that had brought us together in the first place. As our child grew, Daniel and I became more intentional about the kind of family we wanted to build. We wanted our home to be a place of love, honesty, and resilience, a reflection of the values we'd worked so hard to cultivate. One day, as we played in the backyard, our child looked up at us and said, "You and Daddy are best friends, right?" Daniel and I exchanged a smile. "That's right," I said. It was a small moment, but it reminded me of the legacy we were creating, a legacy of partnership and love. As life settled into a rhythm, Daniel began to talk about a new dream, starting his own business. "It's something I've always wanted to do," he said one evening as we sat on the porch. "But I'm nervous about the risk." "I think you should go for it," I said, surprising him, and myself. "You've always been passionate about your work, and I know you'll make it a success." With my encouragement, Daniel took the leap. Watching him pour his energy and creativity into the business was inspiring, and it reminded me of the importance of supporting each other's dreams. As the years went on, Daniel and I made a habit of reflecting on the journey we'd taken. One evening, as we sat by the fire after putting our child to bed, he said, "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" "All the time," I replied, smiling. "And I'm so grateful for where we are now." "Me too," he said, taking my hand. "I couldn't have done this without you." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I realized how much we'd grown, not just as individuals, but as partners who had weathered life's storms together. A few years later, Daniel and I began to talk about the possibility of expanding our family. The idea of having another child felt both exciting and daunting, but we approached it with the same openness and teamwork that had defined our relationship. When we welcomed our second child into the world, the joy was overwhelming. Watching Daniel with our children, I felt a renewed sense of gratitude for the life we'd built, a life that was far from perfect but full of love and purpose. As our children grew, so did our dreams. Daniel's business flourished, and I began to explore my own passions more deeply, taking up writing, even publishing a collection of essays about love, resilience, and family. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel said, "What do you think the next chapter will look like for us?" "I think it'll be just as unpredictable as the last," I said with a smile. "But I know we'll face it together." Looking back, I often thought about the journey we'd taken, the pain, the growth, and the lessons we'd learned along the way. It wasn't an easy path, but it was one that had made us stronger, both as individuals and as a family. Our legacy wasn't just about the life we'd built, it was about the love we'd shared, the values we'd instilled in our children, and the resilience we'd shown in the face of adversity. As we watched our children play in the yard, Daniel turned to me and said, "We've done pretty well, haven't we?" "We have," I agreed, smiling. "And I can't wait to see what's next." The years continued to pass, bringing with them moments of joy, challenge, and quiet reflection. Daniel and I had built a life that was rich in meaning, not because it was perfect, but because it was ours, shaped by the choices we'd made and the love we'd fought to preserve. As our children grew, our focus shifted to the legacy we were creating, not just for them, but for ourselves. What did we want them to remember about us? What lessons did we hope they'd carry into their own lives? One evening, as I tucked our youngest child into bed, they asked, "Mom, how do you and Dad always get along so well?" I smiled at the question, knowing the answer wasn't as simple as it seemed. "We don't always get along," I admitted. "But we always try to understand each other. And we never stop talking, even when it's hard." The answer seemed to satisfy them, and as I kissed their forehead, I realized how much of what Daniel and I had learned over the years was being passed on in these small, everyday moments. As our children grew older, Daniel and I made a point of celebrating milestones, not just theirs, but ours as well. On our 10th wedding anniversary, we renewed our vows in a small ceremony with close friends and family. Standing beside Daniel, holding his hand, I felt a sense of peace and gratitude that I hadn't known during our early years together. "Thank you for not giving up on us," he said during his vows, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for showing me how to be better," I replied. The ceremony wasn't just a celebration of our love, it was a testament to the work we'd put into building a relationship that could withstand anything. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual that had become a cherished part of our lives, Daniel turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about how it all started? How close we came to losing this?" "All the time," I said, my voice soft. "But I also think about how far we've come. And how much stronger we are because of it." He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I wouldn't trade this for anything," he said. "Me neither," I replied. As our children became teenagers, the lessons we'd learned about love and resilience became even more important. One evening, as our oldest prepared for a school dance, they asked, "How do you know if someone's the one?" Daniel and I exchanged a glance, both of us smiling at the question. "You don't always know right away," Daniel said. "But the right person will make you feel safe, supported, and loved for who you are. And sometimes," I added, "the relationship takes work. But if it's worth it, you'll find a way." As our children began to carve out their own paths, Daniel and I found ourselves with more time to focus on our own dreams. We took trips to places we'd always wanted to visit, started new hobbies, and spent quiet evenings reminiscing about the life we'd built. One evening, as we walked through the vineyard where we'd celebrated our anniversary, Daniel said, "I think the best part of all of this is that we did it together." "Every step of the way," I agreed, smiling. Looking back, I often thought about the lessons we'd learned and the love we'd shared. Our journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. As we sat on the porch one final time, watching the sunset and listening to the laughter of our grandchildren playing in the yard, Daniel turned to me and said, "We've lived a good life, haven't we?" "We have," I said, taking his hand. And in that moment, surrounded by the life we'd created, I knew that our legacy wasn't just about what we'd accomplished, it was about the love that had carried us through it all.